Hello and welcome to CollectaThought, the show where I collect my thoughts on video games, and today we'll be talking about 12 Minutes, a game published by Annapurna Interactive, who a lot of you might know from games like What Remains of Edith Finch, Gora Go, which I reviewed on this channel, Donut County, Gone Home, quite a few games that you might recognize, as they have become a very prolific name in the indie scene, probably being up there as one of the biggest ones alongside Devolver and Tiny Build Games. But getting back to the game, this is also a game developed by Luis Antonio, which is a name I know I'm pronouncing correct because he's a Portuguese developer and I'm a Portuguese man. There are dozens of us, okay? But regardless, yes, this is one of those developed by one guy type of games, and in a lot of ways it shows, but it's also a game that is clever enough to understand its limitations and to kind of use it as its style. As we can start by talking about the presentation, where we have a top-down perspective, and the game goes for a somewhat, I would say semi-realistic aesthetic. Obviously it's supposed to look realistic, but the graphics aren't quite there. You can obviously tell that there's no facial expressions, that the lighting is more moody than it is realistic, but once again, like I was saying before, all of these things work towards creating a style, and the game is self-aware of it, given once again the top-down perspective that I think helps a lot, hiding some of the imperfections. I think this game really just would not have worked the same way if it was like a third-person or a first-person game. Also, being this perspective allows it to be more like a point-and-click game, which it does very much play like one of those old point-and-click adventure games with puzzle elements, except you have this gimmick of the 12 minutes, which I will explain, but I only want to get into the story at the end, and so I'm going to explain it through the perspective of the gameplay. And basically here, every 12 minutes the world resets, or the world will reset anyways during certain conditions. For example, here our main character will not be able to leave the apartment, or once again the time will reset. Another common example is our main character getting knocked out or killed, which of course resets the timeline. And so what this creates is a gameplay loop where every run you're trying new things within this world and seeing what kind of works, or what each thing does and how that affects the world, so you can try and progress. As early on it's actually hard to live the whole 12 minutes, as usually something happens before that, but eventually you will, and the game turns more into figuring out what's going on, which turns this puzzle gameplay into a much more narrative driven and dialogue based one, which did make it less interesting for me. I was very much enjoying trying to figure out how to set everything up so I could survive the full time loop. But for me, at least, by that time the game became incredibly linear, because the game never really adds anything new to interact with or gives you all that much to recontextualize, so it does become a lot more dialogue focused, like I said before. Which leads me to talk about also the length of the game. I beat this game in about 4 hours, but I've noticed from sites like How Long to Beat and other reviewers that this is like a 6 to 8 hour game, which I could not imagine taking that long to beat this game, as I think I would have just given up on it. I do think this is the type of game where it would just be frustrating to get stuck on rather than interesting, like most games I guess, but here especially because you're just gonna be listening to the same lines of dialogue over and over again if you can't figure out how to advance. So honestly, I would recommend, if you get stuck, to just look a walkthrough up. You don't have to like fully spoil yourself, you can just look one up and read it from the beginning and find something that maybe you forgot to do or you missed, and that will by itself unlock a lot of things. But regardless, I do think that 6 to 8 hours is too much. I do think you would be infuriated with this game if you had to go that long, and actually that leads me to talk about the story as well, because I don't think you'd be satisfied if it took you 6 hours to unravel this. The first thing I should talk about, I guess, isn't even the story, but I guess the cast. This is a very attention-grabbing cast, but I personally had no idea going into it. I tried going into this game as blind as possible given its mechanics, so I just had no idea that this game had James McAvoy and Daisy Ridley as its main characters. Williams Dafoe voice, though, I did immediately recognize. It is a very recognizable voice, and it is probably the best voice acting in this game by far, because I'll be honest, when I heard our main characters, I didn't think they were all that good. I thought they were kind of just okay voice actors. In fact, I actually thought some of the lines by James McAvoy were pretty bad, which could have been more connected to the writing than the actual acting, but still, I didn't think it was a particularly great performance personally. It's not a major thing, even though it is a story-focused game, since I know it is probably a marketing thing, and their performances for the most part are just alright. So, getting to the actual story, and well, I'm not gonna spoil it, but if you know, you know. But basically the way it works is the game loop is used to explore the past of the main characters, as the loop can create situations where you wouldn't get this information otherwise, like in a near-death situation, for example, or a situation where they don't know you're there. And of course, usually you wouldn't be able to do much with this information in the actual timeline, but because it loops, you always return to this state of so-called normality, where you can use that information to progress the game story-wise. Actually, something this game does really well is this very organic checkpoints where you can just skip certain bits because you have enough information that you can just talk about it, avoiding having you solve puzzles you've already have probably multiple times, which I think is very important at the end of the game when you're getting a lot of information thrown at you. My problem though is that I didn't particularly enjoy the information that was being thrown at me. I have played a lot of games, I've experienced a lot of stories, and I just felt like 12 minutes didn't have anything new to say. It's a very common love story with a very common twist. And again, it didn't add anything like special to it. Obviously there's this gameplay loop, but you get the gameplay loop before the revelation of this kind of generic story, and I think that's very disappointing the way it's presented. It's also hard to be invested when there's very little build-up. You know, they try to have like this romantic scene they want you to play out in your first run, but I think most people who go into this game, especially knowing it's a time loop game, are just gonna start messing around with it and not really want to do that, especially since it's very easy to get the information the game gives you from that scenario just from other contextual clues, which to be fair means that the developer probably thought about that and put those contextual clues there, but the fault of the story still exists. It's very hard to care about this relationship, and the relationship is the main drive force of the story. You're supposed to care about this person, but this person, from our perspective as a player, this character has been doing nothing but just hiding their entire life from us. So they're just distrustful characters in a way, and the other character voiced by William Dafoe, the, let's call him cop, also adds to that, and in that way it's actually done well because it creates this situation where you don't actually know who's telling the truth. But that really only works for that beginning part of the game where you don't really know who's telling the truth or what's going on. Very quickly things unravel that you can just very much through your own interpretation see the twists coming. Without spoiling, it very quickly becomes, and now it's actually just we have to figure out how to explain everything to everyone, the game, which I personally also don't find very interesting, as it does turn the puzzle elements that I did enjoy before once again into that more dialogue driven and less exciting one. Also, something that kind of annoyed me is just how much the possibilities are at the beginning of the game and how much of it just isn't used at all. Like, for example, a major one for me is you can get a gun, you can get a knife, you can get weapons, and you can stash them in certain places, which made me think maybe there's something that's gonna happen where it's just gonna completely change the dynamic of the game, but it never does. This doesn't actually ever do anything, and it's just kind of there to trick you into thinking you can overcome the loop. And that's kind of a big thing for me here, for sure, was that the beginning of the game is a lot more interesting than the ending. This is a big thing with a lot of games, especially in this genre, where they open up to these scenarios where you just have seemingly limitless opportunities, but then the actual path is very linear, which I personally think is rather jarring. I actually think this game is one that would really benefit from having multiple endings. I think that would really add to it, especially since the game doesn't really seem to want to give too much of an opinion on the topics it raises. So by having multiple endings, it could have, while still being like, hey, it depends on the ending you get. You're the one who says if it's wrong or right. I say this because the ending as it stands here, it's very much like, ooh, isn't this kind of weird? Anyways, bye. Which I think also added to me just having a bit of a sour taste in my mouth after playing this game, even though it does have quite a lot of positives to it. And overall, I still had a nice time with the game, despite all of these problems. Especially taking 4 hours for me, I do think if it took more than that, it would have kind of bordered on being a bit too frustrating rather than enjoyable. And so for those reasons, I am giving 12 minutes a 6 out of 10. It's pretty good, but not amazing. And there's definitely enough here that stops me from giving it a 7, I think. Recommendations wise though, I would probably say wait for a sale. It is a rather short game, and once again, I don't think your mind is gonna be blown by it, just saying. Regardless though, I hope that you enjoyed watching, and if so, please consider subscribing, liking, and commenting, all things you can do for free here on YouTube. And regardless of that, I hope you're having a good day, and goodbye.
I am gonna fuck your mind.